So any of you who are here are probably already familiar with Jennifer's writing career. She now has 6 books of fiction published, 5 novels, and 1 short story collection. And she was getting excellent reviews before A Visit from the Goon Squad won the Pulitzer Prize in 2011. I maybe am not alone in some of the book lovers who was a little bit skeptical of A Goon Squad before I read it. I mean, come on, a chapter in PowerPoint? Isn't that a gimmick too far? But I was so wrong, I realized when I read the book. That chapter is not only an example of how inventive the book is, but it sort of exemplifies its emotional power as well. And it also shows how those 2 elements of the book are completely intertwined. It is an emotionally powerful book because of how it is structured and how inventive it is and how much she plays with time. And that's a question we'll ask her about in the second part of the talk. Since then, Jennifer, in addition to writing some journalistic articles for places like the New York Times Magazine, which has won her awards as well, she's been working on this new book, Manhattan Beach, which we are lucky enough to hear from her, read from her. Oh, I'm going to try that again. I'm not the one with jet lag. We're lucky enough to hear her read from tonight. Manhattan Beach is set in America as America is beginning to enter World War II, and it tells the story of Anna Kerrigan years after her father has mysteriously disappeared. As the book opens, Anna, fierce in the face of yet another loss, decides to do 2 things. One is to become one of the first women deep-sea divers for the US Navy, and the other is to find out what happened to her father. Jennifer was born near Chicago, grew up in San Francisco, and lives now in New York City. So it seems simply astonishing that here she is in Lecture Theater A at the University of Southampton. So we're thrilled to have you, Jennifer, and thank you so much for making this happen tonight.
My pleasure. It is amazing. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. So we thought she would start by reading from her new book, Manhattan Beach, and then I'll ask her a few questions. Then she's going to read from Goon Squad, and I'll ask a few more questions while you think of questions to ask Jennifer as well. So thank you.
So I'm going to read a kind of partial and slimmed down version of the first chapter, and so it requires no setup. I think what you'll perceive instantly is that this is happening some years before the incidents that Carole's talking about later in the book, when Anna is becoming a diver and her father's not there. The book is divided into sections, and this first one is called The Shore. They'd driven all the way to Mr. Stiles' house before Anna realized that her father was nervous. First, the ride had distracted her, sailing along Ocean Parkway as if they were headed for Coney Island, although it was 4 days past Christmas and impossibly cold for the beach. Then the house itself, a palace of golden brick, 3 stories high, windows all the way around, a rowdy flapping of green and yellow striped awnings. It was the last house on the street, which dead-ended at the sea. Her father eased the Model J against the curb and turned off the motor. "Toots," he said, "don't squint at Mr. Stiles' house." "Of course I won't squint at his house. You're doing it now." "No," she said, "I'm making my eyes narrow." "That's squinting," he said. "You've just defined it." "Not for me." He turned to her sharply. "Don't squint." That was when she knew. She heard him swallow dryly and felt a chirp of worry in her stomach. She was not used to seeing her father nervous. Distracted, yes. Preoccupied, certainly. "Why doesn't Mr. Stiles like squinting?" she asked. "No one does." "You never told me that before." "Would you like to go home?" "No, thank you." "I can take you home. If I squint, if you give me the headache I'm starting to get." "If you take me home," Anna said, "you'll be awfully late." She thought he might slap her. He'd done it once after she'd let fly a string of curses she had heard on the docks, his hand finding her cheek invisibly as a whip. The specter of that slap still haunted Anna, with the odd effect of heightening her boldness in defiance of it. Her father rubbed the middle of his forehead, then looked back at her. His nerves were gone. She had cured them. "Anna," he said, "you know what I need you to do." "Of course. Be your charming self with Mr. Stiles's children while I speak with Mr. Stiles." "I knew that, Papa." "Of course you did." She left the Model J with eyes wide and watering in the sun. It had been their own automobile until after the stock market crash. Now it belonged to the union, which lent it back for her father to do union business. Anna liked to go with him when she wasn't in school, to racetracks, communion breakfasts and church events, office buildings where elevators lofted them to high floors, occasionally even a restaurant, but never before to a private home like this. Mr. Stiles's daughter, Tabitha, was only 8, 3 years younger than Anna. Still, Anna allowed the littler girl to tow her by the hand to a downstairs nursery, a room dedicated purely to playing, filled with a shocking array of toys. A quick survey discovered a flossy flirt doll, several large teddy bears, and a rocking horse. There was a nurse in the nursery, a freckled, raspy-voiced woman whose woolen dress strained like an overstacked bookshelf to repress her massive bust. Anna guessed from the broad lay of her face and the merry switch of her eyes that nurse was Irish, and felt a danger of being seen through. She resolved to keep her distance. 2 small boys, twins or at least interchangeable, were struggling to attach electric train tracks. Partly to avoid nurse, who rebuffed the boys' pleas for help, Anna crouched beside the disjointed tracks and proffered her services. She could feel the logic of mechanical parts in her fingertips. This came so naturally that she could only think that other people didn't really try. They always looked, which was as useless when assembling things as studying a picture by touching it. Anna fastened the piece that was vexing the boys and took several more from the freshly opened box. It was a Lionel train, the quality of the tracks palpable in the resolve with which they interlocked. As she worked, Anna glanced occasionally at the flossy flirt doll wedged at the end of a shelf. She had wanted one so violently 2 years ago that some of her desperation seemed to have broken off and stayed inside her. It was strange and painful to discover that old longing now in this place. Tabitha cradled her new Christmas doll, a Shirley Temple in a fox fur coat. She watched entranced as Anna built her brother's train tracks. "Where do you live?" she asked. "Not far." "By the beach?" "Near it." "May I come to your house?" "Of course," Anna said, fastening tracks as fast as the boys handed them to her. A figure 8 was nearly complete. "Have you any brothers?" Tabitha asked. "A sister," Anna said. "She's 8 like you, but she's mean because of being so pretty." Tabitha looked alarmed. "How pretty?" "Extremely pretty," Anna said gravely, then added, "She looks like our mother who danced with the Follies." The error of this boast accosted her a moment later. "Never part with a fact unless you've no choice," her father's voice in her ears. After lunch, as a reward for their fine behavior, nurse allowed them to bundle into coats and hats and bolt from a back door along a path that ran behind Mr. Stiles's house to a private beach. A long arc of snow-dusted sand tilted down to the sea. Miniature waves shrugged up under skins of ice that crackled when she stomped them. Seagulls screamed and dove in the riotous wind, their bellies stark white. The twins had brought along Buck Rogers' ray guns, but the wind turned their shots and death throes into pantomime. Anna watched the sea. There was a feeling she had, standing at its edge, an electric mix of attraction and dread. What would be exposed if all of that water should suddenly vanish? A landscape of lost objects, sunken ships, hidden treasure, gold and gems, and the charm bracelet that had fallen from her wrist into a storm drain. Dead bodies, her father always added with a laugh. To him, the ocean was a wasteland. Your shoes are getting wet, Tabby said through chattering teeth. Should we take them off, Anna asked, to feel the cold? I don't want to feel it. I do. Tabby watched Anna unbuckle the straps of the black patent leather shoes she shared with Zara Klein downstairs. She unrolled her wool stockings and placed her white, bony, long-for-her-age feet in the icy water. Each foot delivered an agony of sensation to her heart, one part of which was a flame of ache that felt unexpectedly pleasant. What's it like? Tabby shrieked. Cold, Anna said. Awful, awful cold. It took all of her strength to keep from recoiling, and her resistance added to the odd excitement. Glancing toward the house, she saw two men in dark overcoats following the paved path set back from the sand. Holding their hats in the wind, they looked like actors in a silent picture. Are those our papas? Daddy likes to have business talks outdoors, Tabby said, away from prying ears. Anna felt benevolent compassion toward young Tabitha, excluded from her father's business affairs when Anna was allowed to listen in whenever she pleased. She heard little of interest. Her father's job was to pass greetings or good wishes between union men and other men who were their friends. These salutations included an envelope, sometimes a package, that he would deliver or receive casually. You wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. Over the years, he'd talked to Anna a great deal without knowing he was talking, and she had listened without knowing what she heard. She was surprised by the familiar, animated way her father was speaking to Mr. Stiles. Apparently, they were friends after all that. The men changed course and began crossing the sand toward Anna and Tabby. Anna stepped hurriedly out of the water, but she'd left her shoes too far away to put them back on in time. Mr. Stiles was a broad, imposing man with brilliantined black hair showing under his hat brim. Say, is this your daughter? He asked, withstanding Arctic temperatures without so much as a pair of stockings. Anna sensed her father's displeasure. So it is, he said. Anna, say good day to Mr. Stiles. Very pleased to meet you, she said, shaking his hand firmly as her father had taught her and taking care not to squint as she peered up at him. Mr. Stiles looked younger than her father, without shadows or creases in his face. She sensed an alertness about him, a humming tension perceptible even through his billowing overcoat. He seemed to await something to react to or be amused by. Right now, that something was Anna. Mr. Stiles crouched beside her in the sand and looked directly into her face. Why the bare feet, he asked. Don't you feel the cold, or are you showing off? Anna had no ready answer. It was neither of those, more an instinct to keep Tabby awed and guessing. But even that she couldn't articulate. Why would I show off, she said. I'm nearly 12. Well, what's it feel like? She smelled mint and liquor on his breath, even in the wind. It struck her that her father couldn't hear their conversation. It only hurts at first, she said. After a while, you can't feel anything. Mr. Stiles grinned as if her reply were a ball he'd taken physical pleasure in catching. Words to live by, he said, then rose again to his immense height. She's strong, he remarked to Anna's father. So she is. Her father avoided her eyes. Mr. Stiles brushed sand from his trousers and turned to go. He'd exhausted that moment and was looking for the next. They're stronger than we are, Anna heard him say to her father. Lucky for us, they don't know it. She thought he might turn and look back at her, but he must have forgotten. I think I'll stop there.
It's so wonderful hearing that. Again, having read the novel and see how much you're setting up and how many things are going to come back and sort of have meaning that we didn't maybe catch the first time. That's really great.
Thank you.
Did you write that later on first?
I wrote it first, and it was a surprise because I had been doing research for this book since about 2005, and I was writing other books along the way. So I published The Keep in 2006, and then I continued researching, and in some ways the research for this book I think sort of led to Visit from the Goon Squad, which I can talk about. But anyway, I knew a fair amount about some of the worlds of this book by the time I started. I knew a lot about the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which was the largest builder and repairer of Allied ships during the war in the world. And I knew a lot about organized crime, both Irish American and Italian American. And I knew a fair amount about merchant shipping. So I had some knowledge, but I sat down expecting to find myself writing about the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and I was writing about this beach. So my process is geared toward my being surprised. That's the whole goal of the way I write, is to get beyond the thoughts I can have sitting in a chair like I am now, because they're not good enough. My ideas are not interesting enough. I have to find things that I can't think of. So I found myself on this beach writing that scene, which changed a lot in the sense that I write by hand in this very rough way, and it's kind of chaotic and messy, and often will have cliches in it just because I'm going so fast. I'm not going to stop and try to think of the right word. But the basic moves were exactly as I read them. And it's the opposite of going back and planting seeds. It's a matter of following those seeds into all of the things they lead to.
That's interesting. There's been a lot of talk about this book being so different from Goon Squad because, we don't have 13 different narrators, and we don't have a PowerPoint, and we don't have this or that, and they talk about being a bit more traditional novel. But I feel, you do take a lot of leaps in time and perspective here. And also, in this book, time is also a goon.
Well, I thought that there would be more. I wanted to fool around structurally with this book as I do in Goon Squad, and I specifically thought I would use the device I use quite a bit in there of leaping into the future and having our knowledge of the outcome of events inform our experience of them in the moment. Interestingly, while that device seemed to be, useful in Goon Squad, it was disastrous whenever I tried it with this material. It really broke the spell. No one wanted to be pulled out of the moment and out of the illusion of a present happening at an earlier time. And I have a writing group that I rely on quite a bit just to kind of let me know whether what I'm doing feels alive. And their reaction to this trickiness that I kept trying to impose began with a sort of like, yeah, that's really not working. And it ultimately became anger. It was like, why won't you stop? We hate it. Please don't do that. So I even thought 9/11 might somehow figure in this book when I started it. So I had to let all of that go. And what I found was that it was actually a relief to get rid of it. I had been doing that stuff for so long, and it was really fun to just kind of stay with the moment. But I think where there is kind of similarity is in bringing various genres together. I was thinking actively about the noir as I worked on this, watching tons of noir movies and reading a lot of extremely cheesy detective fiction, along with a lot of other stuff. I love the idea of bringing together the noir, which is a kind of urban, sort of dislocated setting. I loved combining that with domesticity, those things that seemed like they simply couldn't coexist. And then I also loved the idea of bringing in the genre of basically a sea survival story. Even as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, who would have thought that was a good idea to try to combine those things? They seem like they can't be combined. But my goal is always to try to make incompatible things coexist. I think if I can do that effectively, there's a kind of power in that. So if something can be itself and its opposite at the same time, that's when I'm happiest. Like if someone is crazy and saying things that sound insane and yet they also make sense, that makes me very happy. So in a way, this genre collision is probably the point of contact between Manhattan Beach and Goon Squad. And there are also a lot of characters. Yeah. So I do bring together a number. I guess one other thing is these various technical worlds. I mean, there's a kind of wonky side to this. I had to learn a lot about deep sea diving, merchant sailing during World War II, the sea war of torpedoes and ships, and also the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a very complex place that employed 70,000 people at the height of the war, and whose history goes back to the Revolutionary War. So I guess that's, the noir, this kind of technical stuff, a domestic component, and then a sea survival story with a lot of different characters. That's the way in which it resembles Goon Squad. Structurally, it's very different.
Yeah. But to throw another genre in there, I mean, here we are in the land of Hilary Mantel. I mean, it's a
True.
Historical novel without
Good
seeming
point.
like a historical novel, in the same way that, to me, Wolf Hall, though it's obviously historical, it doesn't read like a historical novel.
Well, I'm hesitant to even say it because I feel like she's so good at what she does, but I looked very carefully at her work and asked myself how she did it. And I hope I learned a few things from her, although I'm not saying I think I made some rookie mistakes too, probably. But the thing that I really noticed about her work is that she doesn't ever try to, pan across a landscape and give you all kinds of, local color. Those historical novels are very interior. We're rarely outside looking at London at that time. And I thought that was very smart, actually. There's a great temptation to do that. I think it comes from the movies, honestly. We're so used to getting the shot, with this book in the 30s and 40s, it would be the boys playing marbles in the street, and, the boys playing stickball, and the kids on the stoop, and then we get into the apartment. And I actually did that at the beginning, I have to confess. But I could tell myself that it wasn't working, and my writing group brought me up short on that stuff, too. They're tough.
Another thing I really love about Anna is her fierce sexuality, both as a young girl and also as a young woman. And I feel like it's sort of unusual in fiction, because she's not sultry, but she is very sexual.
It's interesting. That was something I didn't necessarily know about her right at the start, because she is, obviously she's a kid when we meet her here, and she's only 19 when we meet her again at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. 19 was a lot older then than it is now. I mean, we think of 19 as as a parent of teenagers, they're teenagers. But at that time, girls were certainly getting married at that age, and were expected to be helping to support their families if they were working class. But that actually is an example of, I was uncomfortable with what I thought would have to be her sexual innocence, partly because I already had, my first novel is about an 18-year-old who is very innocent, or inexperienced. Innocent is a bad word. And part of the book is sort of about that awakening in her. And I thought, I don't like the similarities here. Like, it just felt boring to tell that story again. And I thought, okay, well, I'm not sure what to do about that. But I was also interviewing, starting in about 2005, I began interviewing lots of people. And I'm very glad I was doing it then, because these were often people in their 80s at that time. And many of them are no longer living. And these were a lot of people who worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, especially women, but also just longtime New Yorkers with good memories. And one of them, who is absolutely living and in fact, very productive artist to this day, is a guy named Alfred Leslie, who was part of the abstract expressionist movement and has made interesting work over many generations. He grew up in New York, and he must be almost 90 now. And one thing he told me, because he grew up in sort of tenement neighborhoods, much like the ones I'm writing about, he said there was a lot of sex going on. There in no way were kids, girls or boys, sort of innocent as we think of it. Now, I think he was talking a little more about the boys, frankly. But I thought, well, that's interesting, because that sort of gives me an opening into something else. that I think will be useful for my character and for this story. So that was true in a lot of ways. A lot of the plot moves and even character aspects were informed by research. Just to give you one more example, Dexter Stiles, whom you may have sensed as a sort of underworld figure, his whole story, in a way, to some degree, grew out of research. One thing I hadn't realized is that gangsters in America became kind of folded into mainstream society to some degree during Prohibition. So alcohol was illegal in America from 1919 until 1933. That's a long time. And guess what? Everyone still wanted to drink. So organized crime basically became organized to take over the liquor industry and to handle the movement and sales and shipping of alcohol. And that resulted in gangsters being part of kind of mainstream life in a way that they definitely are not now. And so that also seemed like kind of an interesting thing that even though I already had sensed that there was a sort of organized crime figure in the book, a lot of things about his particular struggle and story, because I write a lot from his point of view as well, arose from that research. So it really can work that way.
And he has a really interesting moment at the end of the book that I'm hoping you can talk about without, I'm really avoiding spoilers.
Yeah, we really have to.
Yeah. But he has a moment when he realized that what he had been yearning for, he had accomplished, and that was he was American. And I was wondering if you felt he was American because he had succeeded, and when we see him in the opening chapter in this really wonderful house, or because he was violent. And I'm also sort of curious if you wrote that before Donald Trump was elected. I mean, it's just sort of what American is just really, it's very complicated right now. It probably always has been, but
yes.
I'm just wondering if you're willing to talk about
that. Absolutely. Well, I think Dexter Stiles, that follows perfectly from what I was just saying. Yeah. As I researched some of these organized crime figures, what I learned in a way is just what you might expect. They were part of mainstream society, especially nightlife, because a lot of popular nightclubs began as speakeasies and then evolved into nightclubs. So you had a lot of, gangsters, and that was sort of mentioned as a kind of job. Like, so-and-so, the gangster, runs a nightclub. I mean, who identifies themselves that way? I mean, isn't that supposed to be kind of secret? But it was not. And there was one gentleman, Frank Costello, who was he was identified as a crime boss. And he lived in a fancy apartment building on Central Park with other, fancy people who had jobs like, famous actor, rich banker. And then there was Frank Costello, the crime boss, living down the hall. And he and many others of these figures wanted to make the leap into actually just being fancy people, mainstream people, and leaving behind the criminal part, especially because now Prohibition was over, and so the liquor part of the job was not there anymore. And in fact, it's a fascinating story. Organized crime had to find more ways to make money. And so that's when they started getting into things like prostitution and drug dealing. That was much less common as an organized crime activity before Prohibition ended. But now these huge apparata existed and had come to work together, in part because even on a national level, it helped a lot to have other organized crime units here and there when it came to moving alcohol. But the income stream ended, and the question was how to fill it. So it fascinated me to think of Dexter Stiles, who basically used mob involvement as a tool for upward mobility. Became very well, not only wealthy, but well known. He has his name in the papers. He runs a sparkly nightclub with lots of important people there. And so I love the thought of his wish to cross over and stop being a gangster and sort of cut those ties. And so that is kind of at the heart of his struggle. And I'm so sorry, but I'm slightly forgetting the second half of the question.
I was wondering
where the jet
about
lag is coming in.
Yeah, about what you had in mind when he said.
Oh yes, of course. So he, during World War II, there was a lot of unity in America, as I think there was here. There were certainly people who opposed the war, and there was actually more disunity than I had realized before I started doing my research. But there was basically a sense we all have to help, defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. And so for Dexter Stiles, this engenders a worry about kind of what his position in all of this is. Because generally, organized crime is a kind of shadow system that is not working in unison with the federal government, for example, or law enforcement, except in an illegal way, paying people off, et cetera. So it creates a kind of existential problem for him. And so his discovery in that moment is that whether or not he can be an active part of all of that unity and the superpower that everyone, certain people sense is going to result from all this, the American global superpower as we know it, which was something that I was explicitly interested in the origins of. Whether or not he is part of that, in a certain sense, his kind of thuggish, intelligent, wily, shape-shifting spirit is part of that American mix, whether he's there or not. And all of that is very American. Sadly, Donald Trump is sort of a good example of that kind of thuggish American spirit that can be very persuasive and powerful. And when I first saw, we were just talking about this earlier, when I first saw Donald Trump, in the White House, I thought, it's as if a gangster were president. I mean, everything about his demeanor is of that sort of ilk. He has that kind of physical power. There's a kind of, at times, a sort of threatening edge to it, a willingness to be extremely crude and what's the word I want? Aggressive. In ways that we're not used to seeing from someone occupying that position. So his presence there felt eerily familiar to me from my own research and even my own imagination.
Interesting. I wanted you to talk about your research a bit, and I'm going to, Jennifer has told me it's okay to show this photograph. That's Jennifer researching, being a deep sea diver.
It was a brief period that I was on my feet in that suit.
So can you talk about, you're a journalist as well. You work as a journalist as well. So how is it different to do your research and how you use your research and your writing for journalism versus fiction? I mean, it's very different. How do you...
Well, the approach that I use tends to be similar. In other words, a mix of archival research, let's say, an immersion in very wonky detail with visiting as many relevant physical places as I can. And then above all, just talking to people, which always brings to life all the rest of it. So that was kind of how I approached. I found out through my research at the Brooklyn Navy Yard that deep sea diving was an important part of ship repair. I had not known that. And seeing someone in that rather iconic looking diving suit gave me a feeling that I needed to write about that, which I've learned to just trust. There's very little logic to it. I've never even scuba dived. I have no experience diving. I don't know what it feels like. And I'm afraid to do it, frankly. But just the sight of a civilian diver from the World War II era wearing a suit like that led me on a very long, fabulous excursion into the world of deep sea diving. So I quickly fell in with these two gentlemen, Frenchie LaVille and Jim Heimbach on the left. They are veteran Army divers, both master divers, so they had a very high rank. And they were not diving during World War II, obviously. You can just see that looking at them. But they are part of a very tight-knit veterans community of Army divers, and they meet every other year. One of the attractions of meeting is the chance to actually dive in the old heavy gear, the Mark V, as this is known. which actually even these two guys dove in their careers during Vietnam, which tells you how long this suit was worn, which was actually a relevant piece of diving equipment. It's sort of incredible. Diving equipment changed hardly at all from the beginning of the 20th century until the 1960s. It's incredible. Anyway, so they invited me to go to the reunion, and I said, absolutely. So this was in 2009. Goon Squad was not even finished yet when I was doing that. So we went to the reunion, and they said, well, we can dress you in the Mark V, and they did, which was great, although very painful. It's a 200-pound suit. And even the word of you don't put on the suit. The diving apparatus is basically assembled around you, and it's a little like being encased inside a machine. That helmet actually screws into the collar, like a light bulb. That belt, those belt components are made of lead. But anyway, it was amazing. It was great. And actually, the thing that, I don't think I needed to have worn that to write persuasively about how uncomfortable it would be to wear 200 pounds. But the thing and this is another example of how research in some ways engendered the story or elements of it. What I hadn't expected was the intimacy of being dressed by those guys. I knew them just a little. But the job of the two tenders, and that's the role those two are playing, is to, first of all, dress the diver, and then to keep the diver safe and alive while the diver is diving. And a diver usually has two tenders. And so there's a kind of intimacy about that relationship. And in a certain sense, the thing that they are helping you with is your physical person. They're dressing that physical person, and then they're going to make sure that that physical person continues to get oxygen and has the things that he or she needs to stay alive. So it's a very physical encounter. And at first I was kind of uncomfortable. I mean, I was standing there in long underwear, and these guys were like kind of moving me around, and I thought, I mean, I had kind of talked to them, I had interviewed them, but this felt sort of strange to be suddenly being kind of held by them. It didn't seem strange to them at all, because they spent, decades doing this. This is their career. But the startling intimacy of that relationship was very surprising to me, and that I might not have thought of. In fact, I doubt I could have really thought of it in the way that it happens. And then each diver is also a tender for the other divers, so everyone alternates those roles. And so that was very interesting. Another great thing that happened at that reunion was that I actually interviewed a gentleman who did dive during World War II in the harbor of Cherbourg, where he was helping to do salvage work, clearing out all the debris that the Germans exploded there to try to keep the Allies from using the harbor. And he was amazing, this old gentleman named Jim Kennedy. And I said, did you ever encounter a female diver at all during World War II? And he said, yes. In Cherbourg, he had met a Russian female who was diving. And I wanted to learn more about her, of course. I was intrigued. So I was planning to interview Jim Kennedy in the next couple of months, and he abruptly passed away, which is always the danger with someone in their 80s, even in great health. So I never had that chance, but I ran with that anonymous female diver. That was all the permission I needed.
Great. Well, I think we'd like to hear from Goon Squad now, don't we think? I was tempted to have Jennifer bring a PowerPoint of her PowerPoint chapter, since we're in Lecture Theater A.
But well, you can view that in color with a soundtrack on my website, yes.
Excellent.
Although now I have a new website that is actually very fun for Manhattan Beach with lots of pictures. It's the informational stuff is above the water, and then if you go under the water, there's you can watch the whole series of me putting on that, being dressed, but also a lot of photos from the Navy Yard, old interim and present, because it's actually continued changing a lot. And a lot of photos of Liberty ships that I took on a ship called the Jeremiah O'Brien, which is a still functioning Liberty ship in San Francisco. But you can also, if you go to the books section and click on Goon Squad, you can enter my old website, which is archived, and that has the PowerPoint with a soundtrack in color. And I'm embarrassed to admit how much fun I had adding the color. I kept thinking, this is amazing, this is writing, I'm writing. And then I thought at a certain point, no, I'm just choosing between shades of orange. Let's not get too carried away here. And another funny thing is I had never actually given a PowerPoint presentation until a week ago. When I created a PowerPoint presentation of photos about the research for Manhattan Beach. So I actually didn't know how to use PowerPoint, even having created a PowerPoint. I didn't know how to connect it to a computer, how to advance the slides and like stand underneath and talk about them. So I figured I was starting with chapter 1 with the other. I will start with chapter 1 here and just read a slimmed down version of the early part of it. Found objects. It began the usual way in the bathroom of the L'Ossimo Hotel. Sasha was adjusting her yellow eyeshadow in the mirror when she noticed a bag on the floor beside the sink that must have belonged to the woman whose peeing she could faintly hear through the vault-like door of a toilet stall. Inside the rim of the bag, barely visible, was a wallet made of pale green leather. It was easy for Sasha to recognize, looking back, that the peeing woman's blind trust had provoked her. We live in a city where people will steal the hair off your head if you give them half a chance, but you leave your stuff lying in plain sight and expect it to be waiting for you when you come back? It made her want to teach the woman a lesson. But this wish only camouflaged the deeper feeling Sasha always had, that fat, tender wallet offering itself to her hand. It seemed so dull, so life as usual, to just leave it there, rather than seize the moment, accept the challenge, take the leap, fly the coop, throw caution to the wind, live dangerously. I get it, Kaz, her therapist said. And take the fucking thing. You mean steal it. He was trying to get Sasha to use that word, which was harder to avoid in the case of a wallet than with a lot of the things she'd lifted over the past year when her condition, as Kaz referred to it, had begun to accelerate. 5 sets of keys, 14 pairs of sunglasses, a child's striped scarf, binoculars, a cheese grater, a pocket knife, 28 bars of soap, and 85 pens, ranging from cheap ballpoints she'd used to sign debit card slips to the aubergine Visconti that cost $260 online, which she'd lifted from her former boss's lawyer during a contracts meeting. Sasha no longer took anything from stores. Their cold, inert goods didn't tempt her, only from people. So I'm going to now skip. So she takes the wallet and she goes back to her date, and they decide to go somewhere else and continue their date there. Sasha and Alex cross the lobby of the L'Ossimo Hotel in the direction of the street. Sasha hugged her purse to her shoulder, the warm ball of wallet snuggled in her armpit. As they passed the angular, budded branches by the big glass doors to the street, a woman zigzagged into their path. "Wait," she said. "You haven't seen, I'm desperate." Sasha felt a twang of terror. It was the woman whose wallet she'd taken. She knew this instantly, although the person before her had nothing in common with the blithe, raven-haired wallet owner she'd pictured. This woman had vulnerable brown eyes and flat, pointy shoes that clicked too loudly on the marble floor. There was plenty of gray in her frizzy brown hair. Sasha took Alex's arm, trying to steer him through the doors. She felt his pulse of surprise at her touch, but he stayed put. "Have we seen what?" he said. "Someone stole my wallet. My ID is gone and I have to catch a plane tomorrow morning. I'm just desperate." She stared beseechingly at both of them. It was the sort of frank need that New Yorkers quickly learn how to hide, and Sasha recoiled. It had never occurred to her that the woman was from out of town. "Have you called the police?" Alex asked. "The concierge said he would call, but I'm also wondering, could it have fallen out somewhere?" She looked helplessly at the marble floor around their feet. Sasha relaxed slightly. This woman was the type who annoyed people without meaning to. Apology shadowed her movements even now as she followed Alex to the concierge desk. Sasha trailed behind. "Is someone helping this person?" she heard Alex ask. The concierge was young and spiky-haired. "We've called the police," he said defensively. Alex turned to the woman. Where did this happen? In the ladies' room, I think. Who else was there? No one. It was empty? There might have been someone, but I didn't see her. Alex swung around to Sasha. You were just in the bathroom, he said. Did you see anyone? No, she managed to say. She had Xanax in her purse, but she couldn't open her purse. Even with it zipped, she feared that the wallet would blurt into view in some way that she couldn't control, unleashing a cascade of horrors, arrest, shame, poverty, death. Alex turned to the concierge. How come I'm asking these questions instead of you, he said. Someone just got robbed in your hotel. Don't you have, security? The words robbed and security managed to pierce the soothing backbeat that pumped through not just the Lassimo, but every hotel like it in New York City. There was a mild ripple of interest from the lobby. I've called security, the concierge said, adjusting his neck. I'll call them again. Sasha glanced at Alex. He was angry, and the anger made him recognizable in a way that an hour of aimless chatter, mostly hers, it was true, had not. He was new to New York. He came from someplace smaller. He had a thing or two to prove about how people should treat one another. 2 security guys showed up, the same on TV and in life, beefy guys whose scrupulous politeness was somehow linked to their willingness to crack skulls. They dispersed to search the bar. Sasha wished feverishly that she'd left the wallet there, as if this were an impulse she'd barely resisted. I'll check the bathroom, she told Alex, and forced herself to walk slowly around the elevator bank. The bathroom was empty. Sasha opened her purse, took out the wallet, unearthed her vial of Xanax, and popped one between her teeth. They worked faster if you chewed them. As the caustic taste flooded her mouth, she scanned the room, trying to decide where to ditch the wallet. In the stall? Under the sink? The decision paralyzed her. She had to do this right to emerge unscathed, and if she did, she had a frenzied sense of making a promise to cause. The bathroom door opened, and the woman walked in. Her frantic eyes met Sasha's in the bathroom mirror, narrow, green, equally frantic. There was a pause, during which Sasha felt that she was being confronted. The woman had known all along. Sasha handed her the wallet. She saw from the woman's stunned expression that she was wrong. I'm sorry, Sasha said quickly. It's a problem I have. The woman opened the wallet. Her physical relief at having it back coursed through Sasha in a warm rush as if their bodies had fused. Everything's there, I swear, she said. I didn't even open it. It's this problem I have, but I'm getting help. Please don't tell. I'm hanging on by a thread. The woman glanced up, her soft brown eyes moving over Sasha's face. What did she see? Sasha wished that she could turn and peer in the mirror again, as if something about herself might at last be revealed, some lost thing. But she didn't turn. She held still and let the woman look. It struck her that the woman was close to her own age, her real age. She probably had children at home. Okay, the woman said, looking down, it's between us. Thank you, Sasha said, thank you. Relief and the first gentle waves of Xanax made her feel faint, and she leaned against the wall. She sensed the woman's eagerness to get away. She longed to slide to the floor. There was a rap on the door, a man's voice. Any luck? I'll stop there.
That's just such a brilliantly written chapter, as they all are in that book. It's just so how you go from it feels like a live scene, and then suddenly you're in the, she's telling it to the therapist, and then it's back to the live scene, and it's just so expertly crafted. Just
Thank you.
Really great. One of the things I think I mentioned to you that I teach a module here called Great Writer Steal, and we read your book in conjunction with Proust's In Search of Lost Time, because apparently you were inspired by that. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I had read some of Proust when I was younger, but I found it a little dull. especially all the stuff about time. I just thought, well, at 22, why would anyone care? It seemed more relevant when I returned to the book in my late 30s. And I actually read all of Proust in a book group. It took us 6 years. So I guess I was in my mid-30s when we started. And we actually gave birth among us to 5 children in the group. So our lives unfolded in real time with the kind of real-time unfolding of In Search of Lost Time. And as I was reading it, I thought, I just love the fact that time itself is the subject, when in a certain way, time is kind of the subject, or at least an essential ingredient in the novel form generally. I mean, the passage of time is what allows action to unfold. And so in a certain way, every novel is about time, but I love the fact that time was so explicitly the subject of In Search of Lost Time. And I thought, how would you do that now? How could I write a book in which time was actually the subject? And I was also watching The Sopranos right around the same time, and I think that, and I was fascinated by the serialized nature of the storytelling, which was so familiar from the 19th century novel, and the kind of polyphonic quality of it, the many characters, the subplots, and in some ways, almost the buried nature of the overarching story. Like sometimes, who knew? At the end of the season, you figured out what it was all about. But in the moment, I was just watching for particular people and their own stories. And so I had been thinking, is there a way to use some of those techniques in fiction? Of course, the answer is yes, because it was done throughout the 19th century. But I guess I returned to it. The Sopranos stole it from, George Eliot, and then I stole it from The Sopranos. But I think I somehow, without doing it consciously exactly, I think in asking the question of how I could write about time in a contemporary way, the answer was using the techniques of The Sopranos. And so that's really how I think I came to write it. Although, once again, as with Manhattan Beach, I blundered into it fairly blindly. I didn't realize I was even writing a book until I had a few chapters. So in a way, a lot of the technical choices had already been made. I did not sit down and say, I'm going to write a book in which every chapter feels like it's part of a different book. No, I was writing what I thought were unrelated, disparate short stories. So of course they were different technically. So that's kind of how I think that's really what the relationship to Proust is.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that book, there is no present time of the story. Each chapter is its own present time.
Right.
And that's fascinating.
I think that that again came a little bit from the inadvertent way that I began it, just writing stories. But I think also I really wanted to avoid nostalgia. Nostalgia implies a specific present from which we are all agreeing to look back at this time that is a source of longing. But I wasn't interested in that, I think, because my first novel is very much about nostalgia. It's about longing for the 1960s. It's about nostalgia for a time that one hasn't experienced, which is, I'm sure there's a long German word for that. But I was interested in the power of the 1960s on the 60s counterculture on the American imagination. And that era as a source of nostalgia, even for people like me who really didn't experience it in the first place, because I was just a little kid. And that's what The Invisible Circus is about, in large part. So I didn't want to do that again. And of course, nostalgia is different for everyone. I mean, I came to New York and I learned to my chagrin that the best days of New York were over, long over. Or maybe not so long. Maybe they had been recently, but they were definitely over. And I realized that there was something in common about all of these stories of the best days of New York being gone. The best days were always when that person had first come to New York. So what the best times were was a subject of debate. And so in a way, nostalgia it's partly not interesting because we're all nostalgic for different things in different times. So I was very determined, I think, in Goon Squad not to agree on what the present is and therefore what the past is, but to look more at how those layers of experience work together in our memories and our imaginations.
Yeah. And Goon Squad was such a wild success. Was it difficult to write Manhattan Beach after that?
I think it would have been difficult under any circumstances to write Manhattan Beach, because I think it was uniquely hard for me to write a book set outside my lifetime, because time and place are the only points of connection that I ever have to my work in the first place. I don't use my own life, it doesn't work, and I'm bored by it. I don't use people I know. That's too bad, because there have been some good ones, but I do it badly. Much to the relief of my friends and family, they're not afraid. But times and places I really do use. So in Goon Squad, the punk rock scene of the 70s in San Francisco is something I witnessed. Pretty much every time and place I write about in there is something that felt real to me, with a lot of textures. That I have a very good memory. I have a terrible memory for a lot of things, but a very good memory for my life, especially places. I feel almost like I could still walk through, rooms I haven't visited in decades. It's just sort of how my mind works, and even my dreams are very architectural in their nature. So to move outside of my lifetime, therefore making it impossible to use any times and places that I remembered, was unbelievably hard. And I actually thought I might not be able to do it. For a while, this book was so hard to make viable. It was so hard for me to feel I knew enough to really move around and do my thing, which means finding absurdity, humor, as I mentioned before, mixing things that shouldn't rightly coexist. None of that was really working. I wasn't able to do it. I felt very stiff. And so there were about 2 years where I felt like this book just might not work. And I think having had so much success with Goon Squad definitely made those 2 years harder than they would otherwise have been, which already was kind of hard, because it's not fun to be pouring years of your life into a project you think probably won't work. So I worried that I would, my best work was behind me, that I would never write another book, etc. I truly worried about it. And then I sort of got through that by thinking, okay, well, fair enough. I mean, if I've got nothing better, then I guess it's time for me to stop. I mean, it's not like the world owes me a great career. I had already had a lot of good luck, and I thought, I'll be a journalist. That's a great thing to do. Some would say it matters a lot more than this other stuff. So, and then giving myself permission to basically tank with the new book was helpful, because then I think I felt a little less, agitated over what the result would be, and could just focus on doing my work and coming to know enough that I finally could move around and have fun.
Yeah. All right, it's your turn. Who's ready with a question? Yes.
I have a question. I mean, I'm obviously going to have to buy you a lot of your books after this, because I haven't read them. But
Clearly.
I'm here as a fan of Black Box, the short story you wrote, which is a series of tweets. And because of where or when that's possibly set, I'm interested to know how your research, it's been really interesting hearing about your research process and how you go writing. This obviously is, again, a time and place that you couldn't have actually been to.
Well,
how do you engage with the technical process of the tweets, and because it led to such an interesting form?
That's a great question. So this is about a story, a novella really, called Black Box, that I wrote in the form of tweets, and it was tweeted by The New Yorker, and then it also appeared in full, and I hope will be part of my next book. And so the question is, okay, where it takes place in the future, sort of roughly the 2030s, if we kind of do the math about, it's a minor character from Goon Squad is the subject of it. And so the question was, well, how do times and places from my own life fit into that? The answer is slightly. I mean, it's interesting moving into the future. Of course, I'm in a way as ill-equipped to write that in terms of memory as I am to write about the distant past. But somehow it's a little bit easier than writing about the past. In that case, Black Box centers around a particular house in the south of France, a kind of estate where where a young woman, young-ish, she's in her 30s, is part of a civilian spying program, and she's posing as she's just sort of, they're called beauties, but really her job is to cozy up to powerful, potentially violent men and get information out of them to send back to the US government using equipment that is inside her body. I think that's a sort of a précis of what that piece is about. The actual location of the house where she's doing this was based on a place that I visited once that left a huge impression on me. And I had thought again and again, I would like to try to write about that house. It was on the Mediterranean. I think I loved the sort of mythical echoes of that somehow. And I was drawn, much as I was drawn to the image of that diving suit without quite knowing why or where it would lead, I had thought over many years about that house, which I only spent a few days in, and thought, I really want to find a story set there. I also explicitly wanted to write for Twitter, much in the way I wanted to use PowerPoint before I could find a story that would live in PowerPoint. One thing I've really learned, and this speaks to my lack of success in imposing a kind of structural trickiness on Manhattan Beach, is that radical structural ideas only work, at least in my experience, if the story you're writing that way could not be told conventionally, could only be told in that way. In the PowerPoint chapter, it's a very a sort of sentimental story in which very little happens. It would, I promise you, be very bad written conventionally. But PowerPoint is an atomized form and almost impossible to portray action in PowerPoint. It's just not possible. So that suited my rather static tale well. Also, PowerPoint is very cold and corporate in its vibe, which I think offset the potentially treacly sweetness of the story that I'm telling in PowerPoint. So I think I lucked into, and it was trial and error, believe me, because I tried other things in PowerPoint first, into finding a story that I couldn't tell any other way. In the case of Twitter, I wanted to write in Twitter, and I thought, so what kind of story wants to be told this way? And I think the answer I came up with, it's a little hard to answer this because I can only really understand it later, but I had been interested in stories in the form of lists for a long time because lists reveal a lot of information inadvertently. I mean, if you look at someone's grocery list, they're not saying, I like spinach and my kids like bran muffins and I'm gonna get a treat for them tonight, so I'm gonna get some marshmallows or whatever. You just see bran muffin mix, marshmallows, spinach. But there's a story kind of inherent in that list. And that inadvertent storytelling really interested me. And I, at least for me, getting an iPhone has proliferated my list making to an almost frightening degree. I believe there are over 400 lists, many of them long forgotten, I'm sure repetitive. But one of the lists I began keeping on my phone was lessons learned. And I would put in what I had learned from things I had done wrong. So one of the lessons I learned was don't get a Christmas tree that's so fat it blocks all the light from the window that it's in front of. And I think what I wrote was get a thinner Christmas tree. But when I looked at it later, it made me laugh because I could sort of intuit what had gone wrong there with the fat tree. And so then I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to just tell a whole story just in the form of the lessons someone learns from each thing that happens, but not telling any action in a straightforward way. And somehow that curiosity dovetailed with a few other queries that were floating through my head and this house. And that's how I came to write it, really. And then the question always is, I mean, that's also theoretical. What happens when you actually start trying to write it? That's what really matters. And in the case of the black box story, I could feel right away that there was a kind of excitement about the voice. Now, I was writing it by hand, as I always do. And that was another thing I kept thinking, I want to write this Twitter story. And I would try like writing lines across a page, but just the look of them was really wrong. It just didn't seem right. But then I found a Japanese notebook which consisted of 8 rectangles on every page, and it looked just about right for me to write tweet-sized things by hand. So I actually wrote the first draft in that notebook. And then ultimately, of course, I had to type it. And then I did have these frustratingly long lines, but it's a story in which each structural unit is a lesson derived from what we can easily sense is the action of the story. And so various components kind of came together. And the atmosphere of it and the voice of it felt alive to me from very early. And so that's why I continued with it. I have notions like these that go nowhere, but that one kind of went somewhere.
Yes, Peter.
So in Black Box, it's never explicit that it's the same character from the Goon Squad. Sort of in a similar way in the Goon Squad, you hint at links between characters. Why do you do that?
Did everyone hear that? Why hint at connections between people, like the fact that the Black Box character is from Goon Squad, rather than making it explicit? I think that, again, I think it dates back to one of the organizing principles of Goon Squad, which actually derives from the fact that it consisted of independent stories originally, which is that I liked the fact that every single one stands completely on its own and does not require any sort of connection to anything else. And so having accepted that as one of the basic ideas of the book, I didn't like the idea of implying that there were connections that the reader has to make, because there really aren't. And even so, people felt frustrated. They would say, I think I missed things, I didn't get it. And my reaction was, if you think you're reading 13 stories that have nothing to do with each other, you've still gotten it. There's nothing to get. I mean, if it can fuse and become more than the sum of the parts and feel like it's one big story, that's certainly what I was going for. But I felt that if I was asking the reader to start over every single time, I had to provide a complete payoff every single time. And so, for example, when the New Yorker editor bought Black Box, she had not picked up on the fact that it was a character from Goon Squad until we started working on it, and she suddenly went, "Oh my God, that's Lulu." But I don't want to have anything happen because of those connections. In other words, I wouldn't want people to what am I trying to say? I want it to stand completely on its own, knowing nothing, and I can only be sure of that if I don't give away that those connections exist and leave them to the reader.
Someone else, yes.
Earlier you mentioned 9/11, and I'm kind of just interested in the relationship between literature and art and just sort of national trauma, I guess, and identity. I was just wondering if there's any sense in which Goon Squad was written as a response to kind of 9/11, or the sense of the fragmentation that you see in it is kind of your response to it.
So the question is, what is the relationship, if any, between Goon Squad and 9/11? How is it a response to those events? I think that the way in which it is that in New York it was a real before and after moment, and that we all felt that instantly. And in a way, the fact that really Goon Squad and Manhattan Beach, to some extent, respond to it is really shows you how crucial that event was. I mean, every day I ride the subway over the Manhattan Bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and every single time I look and I think, those buildings are gone. I mean, it was just so immense. It turned New York into a war zone overnight, which I think is what led me to Manhattan Beach quite directly. That and the questions about American global power and how it felt to know that was gathering. With Goon Squad, what I found was that I really enjoyed writing about New York before 9/11 had happened. And so initially, the question of whether 9/11 had happened or not was an organizing principle of the book. So it was divided into two parts, and one was after 9/11, and then I loved the thought of going. By the way, the chronology was continuous; it went backward, and so half of them were after 9/11, and then we're going back, and then there's 9/11, which I don't describe at all, and then we're back to before 9/11. That's one of those fun kind of conceptual ideas that you think should really work well. Unfortunately, it worked quite poorly. The book gathered no power with that structure. It gathered no tension. It just was lame. I mean, it was okay. It was okay and no more. And so I thought, wow, what a drag. I was really hoping this would be better than that. It was the first time I had read them all together because I wanted to keep the feeling of each part very different from all of the others. So I worked on them very separately and I didn't kind of line them up at all. And then I realized that my organizing principle of this before 9/11 and after 9/11, in which 9/11 is kind of this fulcrum, actually didn't serve the material well. And that I was denying the reader a lot of surprises and payoffs that were much stronger if I let curiosity be my organizing principle rather than 9/11. And so that's why I came to organize the book as I did. You know, we're thinking about this as one example. In the chapter I was reading from just now, there's a quick mention of Sasha's ex-boss, Benny Salazar, well, actually, no, that's not a good example. In the next chapter about Benny Salazar, he reminisces about having been a punk rocker. In my backwards chronology, we don't read the chapter in which he is a punk rocker for like 8 more chapters. We've got to get from 2006 to 1979. So it's like way toward the end of the book. At that point, the reader has completely forgotten this punk rock reference, so that the curiosity, the payoff of curiosity that hopefully the reader feels in my current progression was completely lost. So this is a long way of saying 9/11 was an important structural feature that I ultimately had to get rid of altogether.
Yes.
You've already sort of touched on time being very important. Which of these do you think is stronger at the end of a visit from the Goon Squad? Time as a cathartic healer of wounds, or as a constant reminder of what is lost and can't return?
I think the paradox of time is that it's always both. I mean, the question was, so is time a healer, or is it about loss? I think one of the things it's one of the strange things about looking back is that there's often a feeling of loss even if nothing bad has happened. For example, having children, looking back on when they were little, I mean, my children, knock wood, are alive and well, and hopefully will be so while I'm on this earth. And yet sometimes when I think about them being little, I feel this kind of sadness as if something were lost, but nothing's been lost. But that's kind of how looking back can feel. So I think, it's a strange passage in that it certainly makes trauma, for example, which you mentioned, bearable. It's probably the number one advantage of time passing. And yet it in itself, change is inevitably, I think we humans perceive change as loss. Changing landscapes, changing personal lives. I mean, one book that I read that was wonderfully helpful for Manhattan Beach was an oral history of Manhattan from the 1890s until the Second World War. So a long time ago. But this guy got started on this, and he found people who had lived in various neighborhoods even during the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. And what a refrain of these interviews is bemoaning the change in New York, which is so funny because I feel like, all those wonderful pre-war buildings they're taking down. Oh no, they were bemoaning the pastures and the gardens that were disappearing to build those buildings I love so much. So, there's a feeling of loss, all the way through. And yet, thank God, time passes, because I'm sure we all have things that have become easier with the passage of time.
Yes. Go ahead. Shelley, hi.
I love that you're picking. It's so much easier. I feel so bad when I don't choose people.
You said from Manhattan Beach that when you spoke to the diver who sadly passed away, you asked if he'd ever met a woman diver, and he said yes. I think you said that you ran with that because it gave you permission, and I wanted to know why you felt you needed permission to have a female diver. Well,
I didn't really need permission to have a female diver, but I don't know of any in America even close to that time. The first female Army diver didn't dive until the early 80s. I'm not sure, it probably happened earlier in the Navy. There are a lot more divers in the Navy. I think it was more there's a strange tension between the need to know everything, to write authoritatively, especially about people at work. It's very difficult to write about people at work if you don't know what you're talking about, because people who have jobs know a lot about those jobs. And the areas of work that I'm writing about are, deep sea diving, ship repair, being a gangster, and the merchant marine. So I had to know a tremendous amount about all of these things, and that's one thing that made the book so challenging. And yet, on some level, I also have to feel absolutely free to invent. So sometimes I'm looking for a kind of, I don't know what the analogy would be. I'm looking for a sort of a backstage pass that I've doctored to get me to a place that's not really supposed to take me. And I think that just hearing of that Russian diver felt like a little sort of, just a little tap of permission. I would have done it anyway. I was already planning to. I wouldn't have been at the reunion if I hadn't been pretty interested in diving. But it was a nice little point of contact that I felt comfortable extrapolating from and putting a woman into the water in 1942 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where I'm 99.999% certain no woman dived.
Yes, Charlotte.
With Goon Squad, did you always have an intention to connect the stories, or was that something that, not in every story, but to kind of create these connections, or was that something that grew kind of organically with the writing process?
The question was, did I always plan that the stories would connect in Goon Squad, or did that kind of happen by accident? I think the answer is kind of both. I began writing stories to basically procrastinate starting Manhattan Beach. And I wrote 3 that were going backward in time. And I think that's why I thought, this is a book that moves, directly back, chronologically backward. The fun thing about those for me was that they were connected. So I was grabbing a peripheral character, sometimes someone only just mentioned or an event just mentioned, and then making that my subject. So there was that kind of fun swooping feeling. Then this is something I don't talk about that much because it just gets kind of complicated, but your question leads right into it. I had 4 stories that I had written in the 90s and published that were unrelated to each other in any way. And I began to feel that I wanted to find a way for those to connect to these 3 connected stories that I had written. And so it was a very strange feeling to have those connections happen. It felt incredibly organic. For those of you who have read it, you'll understand what I mean by organic, because I start this book with Sasha stealing a wallet. And one of the stories that was completely unrelated and had a protagonist at that time named Madeline is called Goodbye, My Love, in which a young woman steals her uncle's wallet in Naples. So those 2, I had written that and published it like 10 years earlier. It's kind of crazy. So it felt very much as if it was meant to be like islands I hadn't realized were connected by a single landmass. But some of those, and finding those connections made for some of the most interesting things about the book for me.
A couple of more questions. Yes?
I had a question about music in the Goon Squad, and kind of it's like the music industry is a thing which drives like the novel and these characters, and like what about music drove character and place.
So music is really important in Goon Squad, the industry. And what about music drove character and place? First of all, I should mention, I'm glad you said that, because I forgot to say that music is a big point of connection between In Search of Lost Time and Goon Squad. Music is incredibly important in that novel. There are pieces of, first of all, it's an organizing principle, for one. It's composed in a very musical way with leitmotifs. There is also a piece of music that plays an important role in the Proust. So I think in a way it was probably inevitable that music would come in some way in my book, which was such a response to In Search of Lost Time. I also, as a journalist, had some failure trying to get assigned a workable piece about the music industry. I don't know what it was. Like, it just never would work out. I mean, part of it was that I was writing for the Times Magazine. They had a very good music journalist, and I had no real connections in that field. And then I was assigned a story finally about these identical twin rappers, female, which was incredibly fun to work on. But then it was like a part of an issue about debuts, and the whole point was that their album was going to debut, and I was writing about the process of that happening. And then I began to realize at a certain point that their album actually didn't seem to be coming out, like nothing was really happening. So as soon as I told my editor, she said, "Oh, you're off that story," and I was like, "Oh my God, again." So I think I wanted to learn about the industry. And in the end, I think this music connection with the Proust gave me an excuse to do what I had been dying to do, which was learn about the music industry. And as soon as just to write the second chapter about Benny Salazar at work, this is back to the work thing, he's a music producer. What do they do? I mean, you have to know more than a couple of things to write authoritatively about the textures of a day of someone doing a certain kind of work. People who have jobs like that generally have a whole store of knowledge acquired over years and opinions, things they're angry about. It's not easy to write about people at work. You have to know a lot, and you can tell in a minute when you're reading fiction about the workplace in which someone did 20 minutes of research. It just feels like window dressing. There's no depth there. So I began just to write the story, which I didn't even realize was part of a book yet, because that was one of those first three that I thought were just going to be standalones, about Benny at work. I started having long conversations with a music producer, and what became so clear was that he was grieving over the demise of his industry. I mean, I was thinking about the before and after moment that 9/11 was for New York, but for people in the music industry, there was a before and after too. Before, their industry was absolutely gutted by Napster, and that after is still in question. I mean, it's very hard to make money as a musician. That's why people, I mean, the Rolling Stones are going to be touring when they're 90. They have to. So that was fascinating because the music business seemed to be a really interesting lens through which to look at time passing. And of course, one thing about all of the devices that we carry with us all the time is that we have our own playlists, which, at least in my case, is composed a lot of music that is meaningful to me for various reasons having to do with the past. So music is kind of a time machine, which I think is why Proust was so interested in it. So basically, I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm telling you kind of why music was so essential to that book. And then, of course, what music matters to different people in the book depends a lot on their era. So there isn't a kind of musical present and a musical past exactly, although, the punk rock moment, I think, resonates as what a lot of the characters are thinking back on. Interestingly, that punk rock, I did like punk rock music, but I loved 60s music. So that's not really my musical nostalgia isn't for punk rock. It's for what came before. It's for what punk rock was reacting against. But to some degree, the characters are defined by the way in which what kind of music is meaningful to them from their own past.
One more question, if we have one. Okay.
Would you ever like to see your books made into films?
Would I like to see my books made into films? My first novel did become a film. It was a good experience in the sense that I learned a lot from seeing it happen. And so I guess because that experience was basically positive, I'm very open to it. I mean, I do sell film rights. I think it can probably go very wrong, and I understand why people. There was one script of The Keep that I read that was just appalling, and I was so glad when that project died, because characters who were not murderers in my book became murderers. And that is a big personality change. So I found that really made my pulse race with horror at the thought of that movie getting made, but it didn't. I'm open to it, and you know, everything is always optioned, but very little actually happens. Goon Squad was and is under consideration for TV series, first by HBO and then many other places. It could be fun. I don't know. Yeah, I love the thought of of another vision leaping off from mine, and I do think that the most successful films derived from books probably take the most liberties. I mean, I'm thinking of something like The English Patient. You have to be willing to let someone do something different and not just shoot the book, because the book isn't written to be shot, and it probably will be mediocre in that case. But I'm always game to watch people do something fun and interesting, even if it fails. I would be open to it, sure.
All right, well, thank you, Jennifer, so much.
Thank you.
That's great. And thank all of you for attending. I could just tell how completely enthralled you were with everything Jennifer was saying. It's very gratifying to have such a wonderful audience. On behalf of the English Department and Writers in Conversation and Human Worlds Festival, thank you so much for being here. There are flyers around and about for the Human Worlds Festival, which is, I think tonight is the very first night. And those literary highlights for those include the novelist Claire Fuller is going to be here, and our own creative writing professor Philip Hoare. Philip, in fact, is here tomorrow night. And then you have a second chance to see Philip, who is our last writer in conversation this semester on December 4th.
Can I interject one thing?
Yes.
I just want to make sure people know that I'm happy to sign books and continue the conversation outside.
Yeah. I was going to say that.
Oh, okay.
It's
Sorry.
okay. It's very important for
Sorry.
you to. No, I don't mind at all. We hold 3 Writers in Conversations every semester. We're still working on the lineup for next term, but we can announce that Whit Stillman, the scriptwriter and director of films, including Love and Friendship, will be our guest on April 30th. We'll be putting up links, etc., on our blog. So please join us in the North Corridor, which if you take a right and then another right out these doors, for a wine reception, which is courtesy of Human Worlds Festival. And October Books, our local independent bookstore, is selling books. Jennifer is very, very happy to sign those books, or if you've brought books along, I imagine she's happy to do that too. And that's pretty much it. So thank you again for being here. And Jennifer, it was just fabulous. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.